Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our podcast, Talking with the UN. Today, we have a special edition episode in English with our special guest from UN headquarters, Brian Williams, who is all the way from the PVF support office, which we'll get into. Don't get scared with the acronyms of PVF. But before we get into that, I want to let Brian introduce himself, tell us a little bit about himself, how you got to the UN, maybe share a little bit about you, what your hobbies are, anything that will help our audience get to know you.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be in Honduras. My name is Brian Williams. I work for, it's a long name, UN Department of Peacebuilding and Political Affairs, Peacebuilding Support Office, Peacebuilding Fund.
Wow.
So really what I do is manage a wonderful team of folks that provide resources to UN organizations all over the world to do peacebuilding work. I've been working for the UN, and in fact, just coming in from the airport, my visitors that I'm coming with were asking me how long I'd worked for the UN, and I think we counted up 24 years. So I've been with the UN a long time. Worked for some other organizations before, from international NGOs, CARE International, another one called International Rescue Committee. So I worked for NGOs. You know, when I was a university student, I was an engineer, but I didn't really want to do engineering. I wanted to join the American Peace Corps, but I wasn't able to at the time because I'm Canadian and American, but at the time I was only Canadian, so I couldn't join the Peace Corps. And I had a volunteer job teaching English in Pakistan, of all places, and kind of got into international affairs from there and did a master's in development studies, and here I am.
Wow, that's a long trajectory of work with peace building too, I guess. And you must have started very young then.
No, I'm older than I'm a look, I'm afraid.
No.
So, not so young.
Not. So is this your first time in Honduras?
It is.
And what are your expectations? Well, first of the country, but also if you can tell us why you're here and what your expectations of the visit are.
So the Peacebuilding Fund is a global fund. We manage it out of New York. It's the UN headquarters. We finance projects in 45 countries around the world, and quite a few of those are in this part of the world. We get our money from other governments, and so those donor countries, taxpayers in Norway and Germany and Sweden and Canada and many other places, those governments want to know what we're doing with the resources, what the UN is doing with those resources. So we're here on a trip. I'm with representatives from 5 of our contributing countries, from embassies. One's come from London. The rest have come from their embassies in New York to the United Nations. And we're going to visit the activities of the United Nations here and speak to partners, government and civil society, and take a look at how the peacebuilding projects are going here.
So how does the Peacebuilding Support Office contact these donors? How do these donors decide to contribute to peace building in specific countries?
So quite some time ago now, in 2005, member states to the United Nations, so all the countries of the world that are in the United Nations, set up what we call the peace building architecture. And really what they decided is, I mean, you probably know from the news, in New York, you've got the Security Council. That's what you see on the news all the time. And then there's the General Assembly. And the Security Council does, they send blue helmets, they send peacekeeping missions, or other kinds of, headquarter senior missions, like there's a verification mission in Colombia right now. And then the General Assembly and the agencies do development work. And they decided in 2005 that there was an important space that touched both of those things. That if you want societies to be peaceful and citizens to be safe and have access to their human rights, that it was a question of development, do they have access to education and healthcare? But it was also a question of peace and security, about trust in government, about trust in your neighbors, about trust in other parts of the country or different religious communities or what have you. And so they created this concept in 2005 called peace building. And at that time, they created 3 things. They created what they call the Peace Building Commission. So this is a global commission that sits in New York, made up of member states that sit on it. They created the fund. So that's my job, is to manage the Peace Building Fund. And then they created this small office in the headquarters, the Peace Building Support Office, that I'm also a part of. And that office supports the commission's work, it manages the fund, and then it does some coordination work across the UN system with UNICEF and UNDP and UNHCR and the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights and different agencies about how they work together to do peace building.
Wow. So we always think of peace building usually around conflict, probably. Like we think of countries that have armed conflict or on the verge of having a possible armed conflict. So how did peace building come to Honduras, where we may be, or not globally, like this conflict in Ukraine, or is not that kind of conflict, but how does peace building come to Honduras?
That's a great question. You know, in 2005, when they created this peace building architecture, at the time, a lot of people spoke about it as post-conflict work. So there was sort of this idea, a very sort of classic idea. You had a war, and then you had a peace agreement, you had a handshake moment, and then after, you did peace building. And I think through time, and it hasn't taken so long really, when you think about it, people said, why should we wait for the war? In most places where there's war and conflict, the social tensions are noted. People know who they are. Maybe civil society notes them, or community leaders note them, or religious leaders note them, governments notice them. So the idea is actually far smarter to prevent the conflict in the first place, and then you can avoid a lot of the damage and suffering that comes with war. I think in many places now, and this is really exciting for me, I worked in this job also between 2010 and 2015, and I've seen a real change. And the change that I notice is much more acceptance now that in many more places there are tensions, and in many places we should be working to do conflict prevention. In my own country, before I say that, you might have heard of things called Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. There was a very famous one in South Africa years ago with Nelson Mandela. Now many countries have Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and like your question said, often they're thought of as after an event, you put one together. Well, Canada has a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But not many people know that. We have one because there are issues with our Indigenous and Native communities that are still, sources of tension and questions about ownership over land and who gets to make decisions about resources and this kinds of thing. And I think what we're trying to say is really every country has risks. Every country has social tensions. And what we want to do is support efforts that look at those tensions, address those tensions, and try to find ways to make sure that they don't result in worsening tensions, maybe protest, and especially violence. Violence is really what we're trying to prevent and make sure that people have access to their rights.
So here in Honduras, you're going to visit like some of these civil society groups that are working with PBF. You just got here, so spoiler alert, I'm going to tell. We've had the opportunity to interview even one of the youth that has been helped with these PBFs. And one of them actually was part of a podcast that was just recently released. So we really see how in that PBF, there was a lot of work around elections, where here we wanted a peaceful election. It really resulted in a high participation, peaceful election process. It was really a celebration of democracy with a lot of youth being involved. We've seen women really being helped to end cycles of violence in this. I'm sure you'll see all of this in your visit to the communities. But how does civil society help these peace building efforts? And is this a requirement for every peace building fund? Or how do they get involved in these projects?
Yeah, great questions. And I look forward to speaking to some of those youth, and I should listen to the podcast.
Yeah.
So we're a United Nations fund. We were created by the General Assembly of the United Nations. That means member states, that means governments. And one of our core principles is national ownership. So when we design projects or even when we decide to finance programs in a particular country, it's important that the authorities, the government, is interested in pursuing peace building. Our view is that tackling peace building is not easy because usually issues of peace building are touching the most sensitive questions in any society, and all societies have sensitive questions. And so you really want to be sure that the authorities are interested in approaching these things. But national ownership is not only about governments. National ownership is about the whole society. So that means men and women. It means youth in different generations. It means all different kinds of communities, depending upon what a country looks like. Maybe it's got different ethnic groups or different religious groups. And so it's really important. This principle of inclusivity goes together hand in hand with this principle of national ownership. So everywhere we work, we try to support civil society organizations. Often trust in government and trust in the authorities is something that we watch as a kind of barometer of the level of, let's say, risks to social tensions or maybe of growing trust or trends in trust in government. And so often we find ourselves, supporting dialogue platforms of one kind or another that bring together communities and civil society with governments. And often it's really local governments, right? It's mayor's offices or, village committees just as much as it is, the ministers in the capital.
So now, speaking about all these other experiences, have you been able to visit many or all the countries where there are peace building activities?
No, I wish. I wish. No, I haven't. In fact, COVID over the last couple of years has, of course, made this very difficult. We are starting again the process of traveling more and visiting more. We've learned that we can do so much remotely. So on the one hand, that's good. Even this peace building commission that I talked about at the beginning, sometimes when they have a meeting about a particular country, and they'll have even civil society briefers from rural areas, and they can participate quite easily virtually. But there's nothing like really seeing someone face to face, being able to visit them in their community or in their local civil society, NGO office, talking to mayors or local authorities. And what's really important is like what this visit's about is bringing some of those who contribute to us, the donors, because they need to make the case back to their taxpayers, back in whatever capital city they're from, to say to parliamentarians and so on, to say, look, this is money well spent. So it's great to have this opportunity. I look forward to coming back again here one day, but also to some of the other countries in the region, because I really don't know it so well, and there's lots I need to learn.
Yeah, and paper can only transmit as much. There's not as really like the meeting the people that have been impacted by this. Can you share maybe an impact story or something from other countries of peace building that have like made an impact on you personally?
We have a lot of great projects. A lot of our projects are about engaging women. So in Colombia, after the peace agreement there are many conflict-affected communities. And one of the projects that we have that I think is great is in those conflict-affected communities is support to women's businesses, because one of the grievances around the conflict was that there was underinvestment in those communities as part of why there was, unhappiness, let's say. And so with the peace agreements, we're able to invest in women's businesses. Some of those women's businesses, they're all ecologically sustainable, so that's already good. Some of them are about teaching communities how to manage the forests. So it's also got an environmental protection element to it. They can earn carbon credits with the project. So it's got like a revenue generating, and it's financially sustainable. So that's a project that I think is really exciting.
Well, here you'll get something similar as to women empowerment. I got the opportunity to interview similarly a group of 2 young girls from an Afro-descendant community who actually talked about that, how their entrepreneurship helped them help their family with the economic impact they were having while one of their parents wasn't working or this kind of thing. So yeah, it's a really helpful thing for communities, and especially those like in Honduras where there's a lot of conflict around them, so they can get out of that cycle. So in name of them and everyone listening to, thank you for all that work that you do from the PBF. And also you mentioned, well, basically the UN pillar of peace, because you were speaking about how after conflict, you usually is when peace building would happen, which is how the UN came to be. So maybe talk about how it's the peace building fund and all the peace building work aligns to all these global work around the peace, development, humanitarian nexus, and all that work that in every office of the UN we have.
Yeah, so I mean, absolutely. As I was saying earlier, we're, I think, seeing a really positive trend of much more openness to looking at conflict prevention. The Secretary General, in fact, talks about prevention of all kinds. So it's preventing natural disasters, and so it's not just around conflict. But there is this much greater sense now and comfort level with working on peace. One of the areas that's important for us is when the United Nations has a formal peace mission of some kind, Blue Helmet mission, for example, in Democratic Republic of Congo or in Somalia, there's an interest, of course. These are very expensive missions, and there's a real interest. The host governments and communities, want to get to a position where they don't need to have the mission there anymore. And then one of the things that we try and do is finance projects so that when Blue Helmets leave, when a peacekeeping mission leaves, that we're supporting immediately, let's say, transition work. So this is getting a little bit at your nexus question. So it's development work, but it's also peace work. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the southern province of Kasai, for example, the peacekeepers have withdrawn, and now we're investing in, actually it's a provincial level Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I was mentioning those before. So it's mechanisms so that the community there, the local provincial government and the communities can talk to each other and work through some of the issues that were related to the earlier violence, with an eye towards, sustainably making sure that violence and conflict doesn't reoccur. So it's, bridging development work really with peace building work. A lot of our member states, a lot of our governments are interested in peace dividends. And so we do a lot of work around this too, around youth employment, for example. So, youth often get recruited into gangs in this part of the world, or violent extremist groups in other parts of the world. And we really want to be able to offer those youth different sort of productive futures. And, that's a hard thing to do. If we knew how to do that easily, we'd do that everywhere all the time. But we do try to work in specific localities. One thing I should say also is that, the PBF, I keep saying, PBF does this, PBF does that. Actually, we don't do it. We're the fund and we finance it. But at country level, it's the UN system, it's the agencies and funds and programs, it's UNDP and OHCHR, and they're the ones who do the real work. And of course, at country level, the resident coordinator's office is particularly important. So they're the ones leading the UN system at country level, and they're the ones that discuss with government and facilitate a discussion within the UN system about what are the best ways that they can help in peace building.
And well, you just came on to my next question, which was about the reform in this RCOs, resident coordinator offices that are around the world. Now, you maybe were before these resident coordinator offices were in place, and now that they are. So has there been a real change with this reform, and is it for better?
Yeah, I mean, the Peace Building Fund, we always work through resident coordinators. So, I mean, the system has been around for a while. So we always, I think, incentivized joint UN action. Our projects are always joint projects. So our projects always have, at least 2 agencies, sometimes 3, maybe even in some cases 4 agencies. So we've always incentivized UN coherence and coordination across the UN system. I think after the reforms, it's a little bit stronger now than before. For one thing, resident coordinators now structurally report to the UN Secretariat itself. So I work for the Secretariat, the Department of Peace Building and Political Affairs, as I mentioned. They work for the Development Coordination Office. It's also in the Secretariat. So it brings them a little bit closer to us. Resident coordinators are, of course, now full-time, thinking about how to have these strategic discussions with government authorities, with civil society, and of course with the UN country team, the collection of agencies. So they have more resources and more time to dedicate to some of this sort of strategic thinking. So I think, the reforms were helpful for our work, and we really work very closely with all the resident coordinators, including here in Honduras, for our work.
Well, great. And also another product of this resident coordinator system, and for Honduras specifically, and I have it with me here, is our cooperation framework. So we have like this the collective work of the UN towards also the 2030 agenda. So regarding the 2030 agenda, how does this match up with the PBF and all these peace building actions?
So the cooperation frameworks are, I think, a good evolution in terms of sort of how the UN system engages at country level. We care very much about cooperation frameworks. Anytime a country, the resident coordinator in collaboration with the government comes and says, we have these peace building challenges and could the peace building fund be a source of support for us? Our first question always is, what does your cooperation framework look like? And it doesn't need to be called peace building. Maybe it's trust building, maybe it's local governance, maybe it's social cohesion, but is the substance of peace building in your cooperation framework? And if it is, cooperation frameworks, as you well know, are programming documents that are signed by the government and the United Nations system. So there's an agreement there, and that's a great basis for our work. So if peace building under whatever label is inside a cooperation framework, that's a great place, is a great place for us to start.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation. Before we go to the last part of our program, I would like to ask you, we are talking about all this work around peace building coming from headquarters, the whole UN system, agency, but how about us as individuals? And our audience who's listening to us is probably a youthful audience. How can each one of us contribute to peace building in the country?
That's an excellent question, and I hesitate to answer specifically for Honduras because I just got here and I don't pretend to know the country so well. I do think, though, that almost all of us in our families or in extended, those occasions during the year when you're in your extended family, there's almost always hard conversations somewhere. And I know in my own case, it's easy to ignore it. It's easy to let it slide. Somebody makes a comment and you go, I'm not sure that's quite right. You let it go. I think all of us actually have a bit of a duty to, find a way to raise some of those hard issues. There's so many attitudes that are built in about others, about the way different groups behave. And I think, all of us can sometimes figure out ways to raise those issues. And it doesn't need to be, I use the example of a family, but it doesn't need to be family. It could be in school, or it could be, going even to like a local municipal assembly meeting and, trying to make a bit of a pitch. But, getting engaged is really important. It's why we're always wanting to support civil society so much, because civil society is the way that helps to channel some of that engagement.
Yeah, well, I agree. I think in Honduras, we also have a lot of, and something that has become very important for the UN worldwide is hate speech. And sometimes we hear it or we read it on social media. And like you say, we just read it. We just listen to it. We don't call it out. We don't put a stop to it. So maybe I take that message too, and hopefully all of our audience does too. So before we go, we have one last section where we get to know you a little better. So I'm going to ask 5 small questions, short questions, where you can share a little bit about it. So the first one is, what's your favorite word?
What's my favorite word?
Yeah.
Gosh, I don't know. But, an expression I find myself saying a lot is, let's fuss with this a little more. And, what that means is when you're working on a project or you're working on something and, it's pretty good, but it's not quite right. Let's spend a little bit more time. Let's go over the draft one more time. Let's go over the approach one more time. Let's go over the agenda one more time. Make sure we got it all right. So, it's connected to sort of persistence and, wanting to do a good job about stuff, but let's just fuss with things a little more.
Let's just
fuss. Yeah, it means, it means to fiddle with. It means to play with a little bit more.
Oh, okay. And what's your least favorite word?
My least favorite word?
Yeah.
But. B-U-T, but.
It's like
because it's kind of a negative thing, and when you're having a conversation with people, I hear it all the time. I hear it around the dinner table and in meetings and everywhere else. Somebody says, but. Find another way. Don't say but. Maybe say however, maybe, reinforce, demonstrate that you've listened carefully and say, I hear what you're saying about, there, I just used it. See, it's very hard. I hear what you're saying around this and that and this and that. Another way to look at it is, but.
Yeah. So
I learned it from my big sister, by the way. She taught me that.
The think about how to
not use the word but. Yeah, that was my big sister.
Yeah. Well, you just showed it to me and to our production team. So we will think about it now when we are going to use it. So what motivates you?
What motivates me? Yeah, honestly, it's a privilege to work for the United Nations. And, I think the United Nations has a lot of failings. I think it's really important for the UN to be honest about itself and what we do well and what we don't do well. But, we're trying to make the world a better place. So it feels good every night to at least know that that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah. And what demotivates you?
What demotivates me? Because I spent my life in the public sector, so I'm very grateful to the taxpayers around the world or charity givers who've given money. I'm very conscious of that. But sometimes in the public sector, people get very defensive of their little office or department or unit in the public sector. It's true in governments, whether it's a municipal government or a national government or the United Nations. And when you lose sight of the bigger purpose, that gets frustrating.
Yeah. We have to keep in mind the biggest impact we can cause. And finally, and maybe this would be around the peace building context, you see, what is missing so that no one is left behind? I can't say Honduras right now because you just got here, but maybe overall, is there something that really you think is missing?
Yeah, inequality. Actually, I didn't answer your SDG question, so let me jump in. Let me jump into the SDG question. So SDG 16 is, of course, what we care deeply about on the Peace Building Fund, because it's about responsible institutions, it's about peace, it's about nonviolence, it's about rule of law, it's about access to justice. So we care very much about it. But there are many SDGs that we care about, and as you well know, the SDGs are all interconnected. SDG 5, so gender equality, tremendously important. All the SDGs around the environment, very important. Some of the really basic ones, access to education, access to healthcare, really important. Inequality. I live in New York City, and when I walk from my subway station to the office, I walk past so much wealth. The world has never been richer than it is today. Globally, in human history, we're so wealthy with knowledge and with resources. And it's just not being invested in a way that is equitable, in a way that is taking care of those who are at risk of being left behind. So we really need campaigns by all of us in all of our countries and globally to say, look, this wealth that we have, it needs to be used to invest in people.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity to have this conversation
on the first
day in Honduras. I do hope you get to see the warmth of people, the beautiful places, the great food. If you get to have dinner today, try the baleadas, which are local fit food. Too bad we didn't get some for you today, but
I'm sure I'll get my chance.
We have to get you one. So thank you so much. We really hope you enjoy and have a very fruitful mission. And maybe by the end, we get to have a little comeback from you.
That would be great.
What was your appreciation of the country and the PBFs that are here? So thank you so much. I don't know if you want to say something to our audience before we go.
No, I just, thank you for all your hard work. Thank you for caring about what the United Nations and its partners are trying to do. And I look forward to visiting your lovely country.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you everyone who has joined us for this podcast, and we'll see you next time. Bye.